Now, where are we today? Let me talk briefly about our political situation in the United States, how we got here, where we might be going, because it is the theme that runs through all of the healthcare policy arguments currently taking place. There's a lot of information on the screen. Just a couple of points I want to touch upon. 53% of the voters in 2008 voted for President Obama. 46% of the voters cast their ballot for John McCain. 125 million total voters. If all of the remaining population had been eligible to vote in the election, which is not the case, there would have been 175 million citizens of the United States who did not vote, but who do work and who do receive treatment for their medical conditions. Therefore, they still have an interest in this debate, even if they didn't cast a vote last year. An important point is that 59 million people cast their vote for someone other than President Obama. So these numbers I suggest to you, the number of people who did not vote and the number of people who voted against the policy or the election of President Obama, indicate that there is a vested interest in opposing the change in U.S. healthcare policy. Still, as you can see, clearly the Democrats control both houses of Congress. President Obama won by a substantial margin in last year's election. And if they can agree on what it is they wish to include in the legislation, it will be passed. Crucially, the Democrats do not agree on the points that should be included in the new U.S. healthcare policy, and the public is somewhat skeptical. Politicians care about poll numbers. I'm not here to argue one point or the other, but the politicians are very focused on what the public thinks. In a democracy, there's only one thing more important to a politician than her legacy, and that is the next election. When it comes to polls, I'm skeptical of them. After all, who answers the phone when they call at 7 p.m. on a weekday? Not me. Perhaps you do. I do not. Nevertheless, polls have been somewhat constant on this subject over the last 6 or 8 months. There's roughly a 50-50 split in the population. This equates with what we saw in the 2008 election. Actually, it's a little bit greater in opposition than in support of Obamacare. Two things of note, particular note here. The elderly are more pronounced in their opposition than the rest of the general population. This is crucial because the elderly always vote. Even in after elections, they're always there. Secondly, an amusing point, only 22% of the United States population believe that their Congress will understand what is in the proposed health care legislation before they pass it. What would the ancient Greeks think of this? In the States, there were elections this week in a couple of locations, in the state of Virginia and in the state of New Jersey. These might be indicative of a new political wind blowing across the country. Both the governors of New Jersey and Virginia were Democrats. They were replaced this week by Republicans in both states. In the Senate, senators are elected every 6 years. In 2010, which is only a year away, 38 seats are up for re-election, 19 from both the Democrats and the Republican side. As you can see here, of course, on the screen, the blue seats are held by Democrats, the red seats are held by Republicans. There's a gray seat and a yellow seat who are of neither party. One is an independent, I believe the other is a socialist. Nevertheless, the majority of the Democrats in the Senate is a very fragile thing, particularly when you consider the number of seats up for re-election next year. In the House of Representatives are re-elected every 2 years, the entire House. And a number of the seats are in districts that have traditionally been conservative or with the Republican Party. Now, if you were one of these congressmen, and you knew what we've been discussing regarding the polls, and the potential change in public perception on matters of political nature, how would you feel about the passage of Obamacare? I think they're justified in feeling somewhat concerned. Will this legislation pass or bust? As in the famous phrase that I shared at the beginning of the presentation, where will we end up? The short answer is, the off-the-cuff answer is, who knows? There are so many moving parts to this legislation that it's difficult to understand if it will be able to pass in any of its existing forms. It is a very close call. The passage of Obamacare, or the enactment of a new health care policy in the United States, is not a foregone conclusion. It is not inevitable. The election results this week may foreshadow the doom of healthcare changes along in this nature, along this line. It may not. In the famous Greek tragedies that we might have studied in school, there was a phrase called Deus ex machina. The literal translation of that is God from machine. The idea being there are all these components in the play, but something would happen from outside the plot to wrap up all the loose ends and happily end the event. That may happen here. Something that we have not considered, something that we haven't seen, may force the parties to collaborate and compromise and to enact this legislation. I don't know if that's the case. No one does. Regardless, if any portion of Obamacare is passed, it will not end the debate. There will be years of regulations enacted, edited, reenacted, potential repeal, so on and so forth. It is unclear if our migration to socialized medicine in the United States will eventually reach its destination or whether it will break down.